Hi guys, I'm Josh and this is everything I wish I'd known when I became an author. Okay, so last week we came up with an idea. I showed you different methods that you could try. Hopefully if you tried a few of those different ones, you can find out what works for you. If you didn't see that video, I'll put a link in the description. Go check that one out first. I did a video on how to come up with an idea and where you can go for sources of inspiration. This week we've got an idea and we need to work out how we're going to make it into a book. I've actually just finished this stage. I'm currently writing a middle grade horror novel and I've just completed writing my outline. So now I'm on the stage of writing my first draft. Go ahead and check out my introductory video if you want to find out the difference between outlining and drafts and everything else. Now for me, in theory, the drafting stage should go quite quickly. I'm the sort of writer who spends very, very long on my outline. And then when I come to actually write the book, that should be quite quick because I know what's going to happen in every single chapter. Not all authors are like that. Some like to do a very minimalist outline. They just have a sort of idea of what it's going to be about, and then they find out as they start writing it. That's fine. Both are valid. See what works for you. But here are some tips for beginner writers to show them what happens in this process. So, what's your book about? You need to be able to answer that question in a sentence. Think about your favorite books, your favorite films, things like that. If someone said, "What's it about?" you can probably answer it in one sentence. You want your book to be the same. And I've been there where you go, well, it's kind of set here and then this happens, but it's really about how that character's dealing with it because this thing happened to them before. No, you don't want that. You want to be able to say, it's about this character doing this in this setting. I don't expect you to be able to answer that question straight away, but we're going to go through some stages of outlining, and I would say that your outlining process is finished when you can answer that question in one sentence. And as I've said before, this outlining process takes as long as it needs to for you. Some people spend absolutely ages. I would say the extreme end of it would be that you know not only what happens in each chapter, but you have broken it down by paragraph. That's extreme, but some writers do that. They know each paragraph what happens. They know what the characters are thinking in each setting, every single person down to the secondary side characters, what their motivations are, what they're doing before and after the scene when we don't even see them. Where are they? What are they doing? You need as much detail as appropriate for your book, basically. And I would also say that you need more information than you are going to show. For instance, if you were doing a mystery story, you can keep things secret, but you, the author, need to know them. The other extreme would be the people who skip this stage entirely, don't do any outline, just have an idea. Stephen King does actually work like that, whereas R.L. Stine, on the other hand, works out scene by scene everything that happens. And both of those authors have been incredibly successful, so obviously both work. Okay, so here's how I do it. I create a folder on my computer for this project, for this book. And I have several documents in this book for different topics. I have one document that is just for ideas. So I've talked before about just having a running list of ideas that you can pull from and choose from for this book. If you have a constantly running one, that's great. Go in, dig in there, see if there are ideas and see if you can make connections or possibly conflicts with what you've got going. That's loads of rich material that'll develop. That's great. But I also like to keep one specifically for this project. And depending on my idea, for instance, the book that I'm writing is set in Cornwall, England. I went and did a load of research about Cornwall, England, and the things that caught my interest, I put in this list. I have another document for the plot, and by plot, I basically mean the things that happen, the events. And in this document, I list my scenes, and I'll tell you the difference between scenes and chapters in a minute. And I do two things in this document, and these are all things that get filled out as you go along, and one document will help another, so you don't do them one by one. It's when it comes to you, and you're using this as kind of like a filing cabinet at the moment. I list the scenes or the images that I have in my head that I want to include just as bullet points because they're in no particular order. And then as it's getting more concrete and developed, I put them in a numerical order and I can move them about and see what makes sense and what would be more effective and powerful. I have another document for my characters. I list every single character that appears or is even implied to appear. So a character may mention their parents, for instance. I'm writing a story about school children, so they talk about their parents. Even if those parents don't appear in the story, they go on the list. And the things I choose to list about each character, and it can just be one thing: appearance, personality, relationships, and want. Okay? So it can just be one thing from each of them. But what does the character look like? What do they act like? What are their relationships? And that can be like, they're the brother of this character. And then on that character, I'll have written the sister of this character. And then the last thing is, what do they want? Their objective. And even if it's just a side character, even if they're very small, and even if they don't have big world-changing goals, I do bear that in mind in whatever they do. There's a distinction in stories between character-driven stories and plot-driven stories. And the difference is basically plot-driven stories, you've kind of decided what you want to have happen in the story. And then you put your characters into it, and that's what happens. And you develop them from the story. A character-driven story is when you flesh out who the characters are, what they want, how they react in certain situations, and then you use that to work out what happens in the plot. Like everything else I've said, both are valid. Find out what works better for you. There are some people that say, oh, it's more virtuous or effective to be character-driven because people connect to characters. But yeah, people do. But people also like a good story, and some people take the opposite opinion, that it's silly to let the characters decide what's going to happen because you're in charge of it at the end of the day. But I would say that if you are going for plot-driven, which I think I do to some extent, you then have to make tweaks about the character because you realise, oh, well, they wouldn't actually do that thing in the story that I have them do. So either you change it or have someone else do it, or you need to change them. And then I have a document for setting, which is similar to character. I would say I actually neglect this one a little bit because I don't find it as useful, but it's still good to have that there. You just list each of the locations that appear in the story, what they look like, any background or significance of these places. Obviously, if you're doing a fantasy story or if you're making something up, then you're going to spend a lot longer on this. But if you're setting it in real world places, I mean, obviously you would put your research in there as well. But I mean, especially if it's a place you know well, I tend to keep that in my head, but maybe it'd be useful for you to write them down. And my final document that I have, I would call it my summary document, as in summarizing the story. And you do this a few times, and each of the summaries that you do become more extensive, and that represents you having a better idea of your story and a better knowledge of it. The first thing I would do is a pitch to a publisher. You don't actually have to use this. This doesn't have to go to an actual publisher. But if you were pitching it to someone and wanted to get them excited, what would you say to them? You're going to have to tell them what it's about, maybe compare it to some other successful books. And you need to do it in a way that you're showing what's exciting, what's interesting, what's powerful about your story. Then an audience pitch. And there's a slight subtle difference between an audience pitch and your publisher pitch, is that you can give spoilers to your publisher. They need to know what's going to happen. They need to know how it ends. But the audience doesn't. And can you now summarize it with that mystery? Because remember, if we're getting to that point where you can answer the question, what's your book about? You're not going to give the ending away because you would want someone to read it. And then after the pitches, can you do a short summary of the story? This happens, and this happens, then this happens. And a long summary where you go into lots of depth of what happens all the way through, step by step by step. And you fill this in parts, and you can put the ending and then the beginning and the middle and keep going like that. And then this informs your scenes. I always dig bits of this, even copy and paste, and then I put it in the scene document and I put it listed. Okay, so what is the difference between a scene and a chapter? I mean, I assume you all know what a chapter is if you've read a book. They are clearly defined. They usually have a number or a chapter name. I tend to think of chapters as suggested places for the reader to stop. You might tell yourself, right, I'm just going to read this one chapter. and it's a good place to stop, to start, and it's a good place to stop. Scenes, you could be an author who does just one scene per chapter, and that would be very simple. But I don't think many people do that. When I think of scenes, I think of movies, and if you were going to shoot a scene, you're in one location, you would get the actors that are in that scene to be there, and when you're done with that bit, they would go home and you would start for the next one. And that helps me to imagine what a scene is. A scene is one location with a certain set of characters, and it's about one thing. And it should be about one thing. You need a point for each scene. You need a purpose for it. If you don't, get rid of it. And I would suggest any time that you would say the next day, blah, 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 or later on, or even if you said, meanwhile, somewhere else this was happening, that means it's a different scene. Scenes can be quite short. And some people, as I say, would like to, every time there's a new scene, it's a new chapter. But people may often tie scenes together and have several scenes in a chapter if they have a similar thematic relationship, or maybe they are recurring at the same time. Okay, so I know this video is a bit all over the place, but it kind of is, and it is a bit of a messy process. It is throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. It's digging it out in the dirt, trying to find out what the story is. And you will fill in these bits separately. You know, you will have started your summary and then you will develop your character. And in developing your character, you realize, this is something that it would do, and that will spur on an idea, and then you can go fill in another part. But when you can answer that question, what is the book about? That's when you're ready to write it. This is kind of the hardest stage to say in practical terms, although I feel I have given some practical advice. This is what you do, and that's when you're finished. You're finished when you feel you're ready to be finished. Some people like lots of really fleshed out, intricate knowledge of what happens. Some people want a vague idea and don't want to be too restricted by an outline. When I'm fleshing out my scenes, I like to start with the ideas I already have, because I tend to come at the story with an image of something big that, you know, could be a big conflict, an argument or a fight, or I'll have an image of a location and certain people there. And this does happen. Just as you're thinking about it, you'll have an idea, a vision of something that can happen. And it's not a story, and it's not even a full scene, but you've got an image of a thing that happens, and then you work backwards. What must occur before it? What are those characters doing in that location? What brought them there? If they're in conflict, well, what's brought them into that conflict? I have a mystery in my story, so I have to go back and plant the clues. That helps give me more scenes. I have to think about why certain characters don't know this, why others do. Then I have to write those scenes. And when you have the story, you can decide what parts go in which chapters. And if you want to, this may be a more advanced technique, but you could go a bit Pulp Fiction on it if you wanted to, and you could even tell it out of order. I would suggest knowing why you're going to do that. Don't just do it because you think it's cool, but if you think there's a good storytelling reason to do it out of order, then you can do it, but don't go there first. Know what happened in order, and then start to rearrange. Okay guys, thank you for watching. I really hope that was helpful. Even if you're a pantser and you don't think you want to outline whatsoever, do try these techniques. You might find that some help. You might just find my way of storing information about your character to be helpful. And you make it up as you go along, but every time you have a fact about your character, stick it in there. It's a good database of information. You may decide that you want to go with my ideas for how to develop your plot and how to outline that, but you don't want to come up with too much information about your character because you want to see how they develop organically as you write it. Completely up to you. And the last bit of advice I would point out is that you don't have to stick by your outline. It's not law, it's not sacred. Change it as you go on. Just as I've said, each of these bits will inform each other. You actually writing the story will inform it. Next week, we will look at how to write your first draft. This is actually writing the story. So we've done the boring bits, if you like, and now we're actually going to get into the words and the language of what we're actually writing. And at the end of that first draft, you will have a completed book. It won't be polished, it won't be perfect, but you will have a completed book. Leave me a comment if there's anything I didn't cover, or if you've got any questions or you would like me to cover in a future video, leave a comment down below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, found this helpful at all, give it a thumbs up. That tells me and it tells YouTube that you want to see more videos like this. And to see next week's video on writing your first draft, do hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching and happy writing.